So, among the many significant things that have occurred in the past 20 years, the first and foremost one that comes to mind actually occurs over the course of a week, and obviously even that week is in a broader context, but it was a week in which the state of New Jersey was getting closer, but still a ways off from marriage equality. And I asked the board at a board meeting one month if we might put a sign out in front of the congregation. Sabina von Alek was the president at the time. And I asked if we might put a sign on the building that said that we here stand for marriage equality. And that was back when our name was the Unitarian Church. And so the board voted to do that. And then on that Sunday morning, that next Sunday morning, the board joined me here on the chancel, and we asked for any gay and lesbian couples who might be in the congregation to come up, and the board asked them to come and stand with the board and me on the side of love, on the side of marriage equality. And then we asked the congregation to stand with us. And at that point, Artis Wodehouse was our music director at the time, and Artis began playing Standing on the Side of Love. And so the chancel was filled with the Board of Trustees and with Judy Tomlinson and me and with a number of gay and lesbian couples who happened to be in the house that day, as we all sang Standing on the Side of Love, and we dedicated that banner that hung out on the building for the next 4 to 5 years until marriage equality was achieved. But that Sunday morning, there wasn't a dry eye in the house as we all stood together on the side of love, and it was just one of those very amazing experiences. Another one that comes to mind, again in this room, goes all the way back to when I was called to be the minister here. I had finished the 8-day week of candidating and preached the second Sunday and went up to the office to wait while the congregation held the congregational meeting and voted to call me as minister. And when I came back, we had done only one service that day, and so extra chairs were put up, and it was a challenge to get up to the chancel from the back of the room, and there were chairs set up in the narthex as well. And I think that David Lewis had arranged for the congregation to sing me back into the sanctuary as I came back, as they brought me back from over in the office. And it was one of the highlights of my life as I walked through the room and everyone was singing, and Nancy Knurzer was waiting in the pulpit for me, and she said something like it was like a 99% vote or something like that. And so then when the noise in the room calmed down, she said, that the congregational vote had occurred and that the congregation had overwhelmingly voted to call me as its minister. Would I accept that call? And at that point, of course, I had to say, well, let me think about it for a minute. And I said, well, of course, I would be honored and privileged to accept that call. And it was just, the spirit in the room was utterly phenomenal, as it so often is in this room.
Not to go back and forth so much, but could you tell a story about when the banner came down?
Okay, so the way that the banner came down from the building, on that week, on Monday of the week that it came down, and I won't be able to come up with the exact dates for you, but on the Monday of that week, the appellate court had decided that marriage equality would be the law in the state of New Jersey, and that immediately couples would be able to apply for marriage licenses and be married. And so I was out riding my bicycle, and I happened to check my telephone, and received word of that while I was riding on my bicycle. So then I come back and we start our week here on Tuesdays, and we begin the week with staff meeting on Tuesday. And so I announced to the staff that everything was going to be different at the worship service the following Sunday. And immediately we contacted all the former presidents that had been part of that journey toward the moment of legalizing marriage equality in the state, and we created a worship service. We held, again, only one service that day. The room was packed. We had the facilities manager take the banner down, and we had the children of the congregation parade in with the banner in a magnificent ceremony. And I believe we were singing "Standing on the Side of Love" again as they brought it in. And then we had either each of the presidents that had been involved or a video clip that they had made that week in telling that history. And it was just a phenomenal celebration. I don't know if you remember, but in between those events, there was the first Supreme Court case that in which the Supreme Court took a step back in making their judgment, and the step back was to say that there could be no discrimination against gay and lesbian couples, that they had to receive all the rights and benefits of marriage, of heterosexual marriage, in that Supreme Court case, and they left it up to the legislature to make that occur. And then the legislature demurred, and they created civil unions, which was something of a travesty, but which is why it was eventually done away with. We should probably talk about that process too in a few minutes. But the night of the Supreme Court decision, we met in this space, and the overflow crowd filled Fletcher Hall, and so we had it taped in both places. And Steve Goldberg was the head of marriage equality for the state of New Jersey at that time. What was the name? Steve Goldstein, I'm sorry.
Can I say that again, just to Steve Goldstein?
Stephen Goldstein is not Steve. Stephen Goldstein was the head of Garden State Equality, and this room was packed. People were nearly hanging from the rafters. Fletcher Hall was filled, and we piped the sound into there. There was press from all over the world. Telemundo was here, and there was press from everywhere. We had this enormous event, and the following day, across the country, in newspapers across the country and on websites, Steve Goldstein and I were standing and hugging right here in this spot. It was in the St. Louis paper. It was in the Seattle, Washington paper. It was all up and down the East Coast. It was in Des Moines, Iowa. It was all over the place. So part of the marriage equality process, and I consider this to be a congregational part of it, even though I was the one whose face was at the front of it, was that I was called by Governor Cody while he was filling in for Governor Corzine. Governor Cody called me and asked me to be his gubernatorial representative on the gubernatorial commission to study the civil union law. And the task of the commission was to determine if the mandates of the civil union law were being achieved, and B, if even with the mandates being achieved, if they were, would it be possible for the civil union law to achieve what had been mandated by the Supreme Court, and that in fact gay and lesbian couples would have the same rights and benefits that heterosexual couples had in this state. And it was a commission that had been impaneled for a 3-year period. We ended up finishing our work in 2 years' time. We held hearings all over the state, and then continued our work in Trenton on a regular basis, either twice or once monthly. We would meet, and what we discovered was what one might have expected that we would. That first of all, that the laws as they had been stipulated by the legislature were not being met, but that our investigations through in-state and out-of-state exploration showed that even if they were met, it could not achieve the mandate of the Supreme Court. What's interesting is that when we tendered our final report, it was immediately shelved by both the governor and by the legislature, and they didn't use it to bring about marriage equality. But the state of California and a number of other states cited our report, the commission's report from New Jersey, in legalizing marriage equality in those states. And another significant moment, which was probably a defining moment, I think, in my ministry here, was September 11th, 2001. The towers were hit and collapsed in the morning, and within very little time, I recognized that we needed to have some kind of worshipful event that evening, and we began letting people know. Jerry, you and Karen came into my office that day, and we talked about what was going on and how we might begin to try to make sense of it, although on that particular day it was awfully early to make any sense out of anything. But I will not forget that night when we put together a worship service that had a great deal of song and some readings, and I prepared a short message. And the place filled up, and what I remember from that night was the power that was generated in this room by people coming to their religious home in order to gain a sense of finding themselves on that day when so much was lost.
Many people from the community also who were looking for something. So
that happened on the following Sunday more, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. But on the night of September 11th, it was mostly our community, mostly our congregation that came. There were people from the community, but it was primarily members of our congregation who were here, and people that I know were in the neighborhood of the World Trade Center. People I know who made it back across the Hudson River by helter-skelter. People who got to this side of the river and were hosed off by fire hoses, and people who had been through hell that day personally in the midst of that experience, and then the rest of us who had been through hell that day because here we were on that day. And the thing that was a miracle to me that day was watching the people come in for that 7 o'clock in the evening service, just rounded shoulders and sagging heads and sagging bodies and just struggling to be. And when we left, we went out and we sang our final song out on the front lawn. And as people walked out to do that, shoulders were back and squared a bit more, and heads were being held just a little bit higher, and it just felt like the community had come together in a way that it allowed itself to serve itself. People came, and in serving the others who were here, were served, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah, so that seemed to have had an effect for a long time in the congregation.
It did.
Do you want to talk a little?
Well, just then that following Sunday, our normal attendance on Sundays has ranged off and on through the years. But in those days, not too different from now, but in those days, we would have maybe 150 or so people on a Sunday morning at the second service, and maybe around 80 or so people at the first service, 80 to 100 people at the first service. On that following Sunday, between the two services, there were 1,500 people who were here for the worship service. Not just did our congregation need to find a place where they could draw strength, but the people from the broader community who did not have religious congregations to turn to came here, and they were here with us, and it was enormous on that next Sunday. Again, we were set up in Fletcher Hall again, and that was the case for the next 2, 3, 4 Sundays after that, as this became kind of a central place for people to come to find comfort and strength in a time of distress. Because there's really one more fundamental event that is essential in the shaping of our shared ministry, I think. And what that was the creation of our after-school program. Back in 1997, Bill Brock and Frank Rennie had this dream of creating an after-school program for students of Hillside School just up the street who would, in the 3rd grade, be identified as being at risk, and we would bring them into our facilities. We would have tutors for them, and we would try to make a difference in their academic lives that might provide for a difference in their future lives. And the program began. All these many years later, it is still going strong. It's now run by Pete Williams, and in my mind, it's that program, as well as there's so many fundamental pieces, Jerry. That program has, I think, kept the congregation very honestly connected to its roots and to its mission in ways that other programs can't possibly.
Because it's mentoring as well as education.
It's mentoring as well as education, and it is rooted in relationship. And those are key things. One other fundamental piece that I forgot that is huge. But, we get used to these things and we don't think of them necessarily in their very origin. But we went from having a director of religious education many years ago to having a minister of religious education, and recognized that the religious education of our children is a core element of the ministry of this congregation. And so we have had ministry and professional ministry in the leadership of that program ever since. So that's been for the past now 15 years, and that's essential in terms of who the congregation is and a part of this ministry that we've shared over these years, over these score of years. What I would want people to know about the role that the congregation has played in fulfilling our mission. Our mission is to be a liberal religious community seeking transformation in our hearts, our homes, our community, and our world. And the way that this congregation has served both by being the people power and by being the place, the way the congregation has served in transforming our community has been incredible over the years. I'll leave it to the students of history to find before my tenure here, and there are great records of that. But just during my tenure here, I mean, one of the really huge things that was going on when I arrived was the Undoing Racism Committee. Had been very active for maybe 3 or 4 years, and they were bringing in the People's Institute. And in my first year here, the People's Institute were brought in by our Undoing Racism Committee. One of their 3-day workshops occurred, and people in attendance of that were not just members of this congregation. The mayor of Montclair was there, and that mayor was not Jerry Freed, but a previous mayor of Montclair. There were 2 or 3 of the council members that were there. The chief of police was there. We were having an impact on the way that the town of Montclair understood the role of race and the dynamics of civility here. We helped the larger community to understand that racism was woven into the fabric of our society, and that if we were not paying attention to those threads in that fabric, we were supporting them and we were providing continuity for them. And that's what the Undoing Racism Committee did. Another piece that was going on was that the congregation was in the final steps of completing the Welcoming Congregation program, a program of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, in which the congregation really did a lot of self-exploration, again, looking to see where individuals and the congregation helped to maintain homophobia so that we could learn to work against it. And that was all going on. Okay, so let me tell you why I chose to come to Montclair. You know, I can't answer why Montclair chose to call me, but I can tell folks about why I chose to come to Montclair. At the time, in 1995, I was in conversation with 7 other congregations about being their candidates at various points in the process. And when I was first asked about Montclair, I said, oh no, I certainly don't want to be that close to the city of New York. And then when the chair of the search committee, Diane Connell, who I will be meeting with later today, by the way, called me and asked me if I would be interested, I said, well, I will certainly look at it. You know, please send me your packet, I'll send you mine. And so when I got the packet and saw the incredible history of involvement of the congregation, I was incredibly impressed. And what impressed me was that I saw an alignment between my social justice history and this congregation's social justice history. And I wanted to be, I thought, with a congregation that took social justice as seriously as I do as a part of their religious life. And so I said, yes, I would be interested in being part of the conversation with you. And in the end, I said, no, thank you to all of those other congregations, and yes, please, to Montclair. And the reason was because, A, I knew that in Montclair, with the level of involvement and the level of expertise and artistry of the people here, that I would be called every day to be the best minister that I could be. And second, that, you know, this marriage of ministry in a congregation that understood and required social justice as a part of who they are. And so I said, yes, give me that, please. And it's been the case ever since. I'd like to talk for a moment or two about the shared ministry of the congregation. One of the changes that I sought and we made when I first got here was changing something that had been called the Ministerial Relations Committee to a Committee on Ministry. And now that Committee on Ministry has become the Council on Ministry. And when it was the Ministerial Relations Committee, it was a group of people that were chosen by both the minister and the congregation in order to serve as a kind of a go-between the congregation and the minister in terms of the relationship. Because the minister, in our kind of polity, of congregational polity, doesn't have a boss. I'm called by the congregation. I can be dismissed only by the congregation. And since that conversation would be an awfully large and unwieldy one, the way that we stay in relationship is via that mechanism of that committee. But in the work associational work that I was doing prior to coming here, I was very involved in changing the way the congregations viewed the work of that committee and the relationship between minister and congregation. And so we began having a committee on ministry, and that committee on ministry was tasked with assessing the various levels of of ministry within the congregation, as well as the professional ministry. And so the way that we do that is, you know, what is our ministry? What is our shared ministry? Everything that any of us do towards the fulfillment of our covenant is that shared ministry. So our covenant, transformation of our hearts, our homes, our community, and our world. Any of the work that we do, whether it be building maintenance and grounds maintenance, that supports that work, that's ministry. Whether that be greeting people in the narthex as they come in, whether that be serving coffee, whether that be working in the archive room, whatever work is done to support this congregation and to support the programs of this congregation is the ministry. So the Committee on Ministry, now the Council on Ministry, is tasked with monitoring and reporting on the health of those ministries wherever they are, as well as the health of the professional ministry, now with 2 professional ministers. Another shift in the way that we've been doing religious life in our congregation was a shift that we made 4 years ago now, from having Judy Tomlinson's title being the Minister of Religious Education to being Associate Minister. She hasn't lost religious education from her portfolio, but some very vital aspects of congregational life have been added to that. I call her our Minister of Infrastructure. And so what falls under her ministry at this point includes our covenant group ministries. Our covenant group ministries, which allow for small groups to provide the very essential close relationships that people come into larger congregations to find. We say that in our covenant groups, people are here to find the intimate while exploring the ultimate, and that has changed the way I think we do congregation, because there is an ethos now of that small group involvement, and it permeates well beyond those covenant groups. We look at ministries in other ways. We have a music ministry now, as well, with Marcus Gray Hauk as our music minister. And I'm going out of order, but to go back to the infrastructure pieces of it, another aspect of it that comes under Judy's title is the membership committee, which is something we have stepped up to and stepped back away from so many times over the years, but over the last 4 years, we've taken very seriously that if people are going to remain as members and vital members of this congregation, it will be because of the connections that they make here. And so the membership committee is looking at how is it that we integrate people as they come in? How is it that we help people to connect with various aspects of the congregation life? And how is it that we help people to remain connected with the congregation? And that's enormous. Another aspect that's come out of this whole thing is an adult religious education program that has probably changed the congregation more than any other adult program we've ever had, and that's the Harvest the Power program, which is a very in-depth process in which members of the congregation, some of whom have volunteered and some of whom have been invited, undergo an exploration of the traditions of this congregation and of our larger religious movement, as well as leadership orientation that over the last 4 years have changed the way even that things go with our nominating and leadership development committee, to the point of searching for people who might be willing to be on the board of trustees, to having to winnow down the number of volunteers of people who want to serve in those larger capacities. Phenomenal change in the way we do business. If I were able to address the interim minister coming in, I would want them to not know terribly much, because I would want them to learn it with the leadership and with the members of the congregation in ways that would cause the leadership and membership to articulate things to the interim minister, so that that minister could be helpful in making evident the things that are more tacit. But the one thing that I would want forgiveness from the interim minister for is the way in which over 20 years' time some in-house things have become overly comfortable, and those are going to be challenges that they will need to face on behalf of the settled minister that will follow the interim. And an example that I would give of that is a number of years ago, I tried very hard to try to bring in the way that we do our remembrances, our joys and concerns during the worship service, recognizing that that is so clearly one of the areas that is a barometer of congregations' willingness to grow. And we tried and we did not succeed in changing that pattern. And I'm hoping that the interim minister will be able to come in and, in a very good-natured way, work with the congregation in experimenting with different ways of accomplishing remembrances. I would own that as my biggest sin, and it's not the congregation's fault, it's my fault, and I leave that to you, interim minister, to work with the congregation on finding a way that allows this congregation to remain true to heart and a way to step into the future that they want. Here's what I would want the settled minister to know coming in to this congregation. Way to go. You've come through an incredible process to be here. The congregation has come through an incredible process in order for you to be here. I have to imagine that that the discernment process you went through in order to be at this point is one that has allowed you to know that the history of this congregation is one in which so many things are evident, but three things that I would just hold up for you, and one of those is that in this congregation there are two things because I'm going to marry two things. There are two things that I would want you to know from the history that you've probably already discerned, but I would hold them up. And first among them is that this congregation has learned incredibly well to marry the need, the personal and communal need of the dynamics of spirituality with justice. And the marriage of spirituality and justice have created a character of religion in this congregation that go all the way back to 1897 when this congregation was formed and throughout every decade ever since. The second piece that I would hold up for you is that the level of intellect, the level of commitment, the level of expertise, the level of artistry in this congregation is higher than I have experienced in any other congregation, whether I was visiting that congregation or whether I have been minister to that congregation. And you have been called yourself to be the best minister you can possibly be. And by being in that environment, it's made much more easy to accomplish for you. And I would just hold that up for you to know. I would like to talk about this congregation as a teaching congregation for a moment. And by way of that, I would say that I know that a fundraiser is underway to create a permanent endowment so that this congregation will, on an every other year basis, be able to fund an intern minister line in the budget. And I just want to, for whoever might be observing this video, to encourage you to give gobs of money to that so that it can happen, so that the principal will never have to be touched and will be able to take interest out in order to support such a budget line. Having said that, what I would want you to know is that this congregation over the years has turned out incredible ministers. Going back to my first years here, we ordained John Tolley, who had been a director of religious education. We ordained him, he left, and he was minister of religious education up at Westport, Connecticut. Former president of our congregation, Craig Hirschberg, was ordained by this congregation very early on in my tenure here. early as well was the 2-year part-time internship of Rosemary Bray McNatt and her ordination that occurred here. And Rosemary has gone on now after a long ministry at Fourth Universalist in the city to being the president of Starr King School for the Ministry out in Berkeley, California. Cheryl Walker was an intern minister here and had a wonderful internship with our congregation and was ordained at All Souls, but we were a part of that with her. And she's now serving a congregation down in the Carolinas. Wendy Pantoja, who now serves a congregation in Miami, Florida, did her internship with us. Since I've been here in the last 20 years, members of the congregation going on to seek ordination include Jan Carlson Bull, Susan McGinn, David Messner, and recently we have as students Kimberly Johnson and Terry Cummings, Barnaby Feeder as well. You know, one other thing I would want to hold up for the congregation, because I don't think very many people are aware of this, but in terms of their being supportive of the future of Unitarian Universalist ministry, is that during my tenure here, I have mentored many students and new ministers both that have not been a part of our congregational life in any way. Currently, I'm mentoring 5 different new UU ministers, and you know, over the 2 decades here, there have been dozens, in the congregation. By supporting me, has supported that ministry as well. When I first came here, I'm looking. You cannot see it, but I'm looking at the pulpit. When I first came here, the desk on the pulpit here for this congregation was about this wide. And I came from a congregation where I could actually lay out 8 sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper without them touching each other on the desk of the pulpit. And this was not large enough for 2 pieces to be there. And before I could preach my first sermon, I built the new desktop. And I had recovered a big old oak desk at home and had some leftover materials. And so from the very same piece of oak that covers my desktop at home, I bring my sermon and preach it from a desktop made of the same materials that has been here and in place since my first week here. Let me talk about the building for just a moment and the changes that it's gone through in the last 20 years. When I came, the facilities were in reasonably good condition. I didn't look at anything and think, oh my. But over those first few years, the building started to show some wear, and there were a number of places in the ceiling here where plaster was beginning to fall. And members of the congregation, leadership of the congregation, began to recognize that we needed to have a capital campaign and we needed to take care of the facilities that had been left to us for the people of the future. And so Chris Corbett, Nancy Felix, Janice Maffei, and I met for a year. We called ourselves the Gang of Four, and we were the core elements. And then we brought in a consultant, Michael Evers, and then brought in quite a number of people who had been in leadership and were currently in leadership in the congregation, and had an enormously successful capital campaign where we raised just over $1 million. And you know, not only did we bring the facilities back up to what they needed to be, but we brought them beyond so that we were really stepping into the future. Under the guidance of David Lewis and Karen Nielsen-Fried, a designer was brought in, and you know, our sanctuary for years had been white walls and overly lacquered wood, and a new vision for what this space might look like came into being through David and Karen and the designer that they had brought in. And so they reached back into Unitarian history and came up with the connections with Frank Lloyd Wright and with the arts and crafts movement that this building was based on, and came up with color schemes that came out of that movement and transformed what had been a very lovely sanctuary into what I find a stunningly beautiful sanctuary. And there were a number of longtime members of the congregation that struggled with that for a while, and Gene Nowak, who is one of my favorite people on the entire planet, continues to struggle with it a little bit, but most people came to appreciate the beauty that is so rich in the new design. And I have not ever walked into this room with a person seeing it for the first time where they don't catch their breath and say, "Isn't this something?" Another one of those idiosyncratic pieces for me is when the lights are on in the room and I'm looking out, one of the most attractive pieces to me in the whole scheme of things is the grill work in front of the organ pipes up in the choir loft. When the lights are on up there, it is just stunningly beautiful because it brings in all of the elements of the design that are throughout the rest of the room. You know, some people might know that these chairs, the chairs that we have here in the sanctuary, were made for this sanctuary. The lines of the chairs match the lines of the rest of the architecture in the room. And when it came time we had to do something because the chairs were falling into outrageous disrepair. And when those chairs had been initially bought in the year 1905, we found the receipt, and they cost $1.68 per pair for those chairs. And we priced out having them refurbished, which meant every stick of wood being removed from every other stick of wood, everything totally coming apart, the iron parts, some of them being remanufactured and so forth. And it ended up costing something in the neighborhood of $1,100 to repair each pair of chairs. And the congregation decided that indeed it was worth preserving that history because we can build a good future on a solid history. And not only the history, but the original integrity of the design of the room was saved as a result of that incredible investment. I would like to say something about how this congregation has helped to shape who I am, and I will do that without, I hope, getting terribly emotional about it.
Good luck.
But
I've seen attempts at that.
Members of the congregation know that, and I tell every new class of new UUs that I'm a sap and that people have just grown used to that. But, what I would want the congregation to know is that, as I spoke about those formational pieces of our shared ministry, those were not just formational pieces of our shared ministry. They were formational pieces in my life. And what the congregation has done for me is to fulfill a quote by 19th century Unitarian minister Eleanor Gordon, a quote that I used on my ordination invitations. It was the theme of my ordination way back when I was ordained, and is on emails that go out from either of my computers, a quote that says that we were given life to find its meaning. And what the congregation has done for me is it has provided me cause and reward. The days and the weeks and the months following September 11th were a challenge for any of us in this country, and I say especially in this area, to find and make meaning. How do we respond to the heinousness of those acts, and how do we respond to the desolation of a history that had encouraged us to think that we were immune? And what happened in those days and weeks and months to follow was that the congregation looked to me to see how I was making sense of those things. And had I not been here, I would not have even attempted to make sense of how my life connected to those things. But by being here, I had no choice but to connect my life to those events in a way that allowed others to connect them to their lives. And I think that in that experience, there was a shift in my ministry here that caused me to know that no matter what I was doing, that was what I was doing. That I was connecting my life to the events of our day in ways that helped, I hoped, others to be able to connect theirs. One of the great blessings in being in a ministry as long as this one has been is the front end of it, in which I get to meet people who have been here, people who had been here for a very long time. You know, there's a whole generation that's older than me, and I'm afraid so many of them have been lost since I've been here. But and I don't, you know, I'm afraid in naming names just because of all the names that I would leave off. But you know, one of the names that I can hold up, because she was the president of the congregation when I arrived, and if ever I had a question at all about the history of the congregation, I could turn to Nancy Knertzer, who was third generation in her family member of this congregation. She was the president when I came. She was the chief historian of putting together the centennial history back in 1997, and someone with whom I just became so close to. You know, I would be on the phone with Nancy all the time. Okay, two quick Nancy Knertzer stories. One is that she was president when I came. She wasn't altogether sure when I first arrived if she was going to, just how she was going to take to this new minister coming down from Massachusetts, yada yada. And so she asked me early on. She said, "So how long do you think you might want to be the minister here in Montclair?" And I said, I don't know. I'm thinking maybe 10 years. I want to see my children all the way through their primary and secondary education, and I'm thinking maybe 10 years. Nancy called me on my 10th anniversary and said, "You may not leave." And you know, I was amazed that she remembered the conversation, and she was amazed that I thought she might have forgotten it. The other story is that Nancy was really in her deathbed a few years back when I left to take my bicycle riding tour across the country. And we knew that when I said goodbye, that it would be our last goodbye. And she wanted me to know that she was thrilled that I was leaving to ride my bicycle across the country. You know, neither of us knew at that time, but I was in touch by telephone with Chris. She died at home. I was in touch with her daughters, Chris and Lee, as that process was going on. And the last 36, 48 hours were just really pretty rough. And in the end, Lee held the phone up to Nancy's ear, and I was able to say goodbye to her one more time. And then, as Lee told me later on, it was only moments after that Nancy had died. So she's someone in particular who I will always hold in my heart, but she's also an iconic representation of so many from that generation who have been such stalwart, wonderful members of this congregation, and who I have had the great pleasure of being in relationship with. I want to give you a little bit of history about the name change. And the history is that there had been an attempt to change the name of the congregation from the Unitarian Church of Montclair during the interim ministry that preceded my arrival here. And wisely, people decided to wait until the new minister got here. Well, I got here and I said, there is no way in the world I'm going to attach myself to this effort in my first year of ministry here. That would be, foolhardy for me and for the congregation. And there was something put before the congregation, and it needed by the bylaws for something that large, it needed a 2/3 majority, and it did not get that. But only by a few votes did it not get that. But fortunately, Fortunately, really, it took more time. And I was always for the change to Unitarian Universalist and congregation, all of those changes. At Montclair, I can take or leave. But Unitarian Universalist congregation was something that I absolutely was always for. And so I would bring that up with my new UU classes over the years and wonder when it was going to re-emerge in the ethos of things. And then you, Jerry Freed, and a number of other people picked it up finally about 10 years ago and conducted what I felt was one of the most thorough processes of transformation that could have occurred around a name change, so that, going from more than a third of the congregation being against changing a name in the previous vote, because of the thoroughness, because everyone in the end felt that they had been heard, because of the efficacy and intention in changing the name. By the time we got down to the vote, my recollection is that there was not a single no vote. There were maybe 3 or 4 abstentions, but that we were ready to move into the future with a new name that took into account both sides of our tradition, as well as taking into account naming ourselves as an institution that was non-sectarian, that was Unitarian Universalist and a religious society by being a congregation rather than by coming down a particular sectarian tradition. If there was a single person in the congregation who felt that they had not been part of the conversation about the name change, that could only have been true if they had attempted to not be in the conversation. Everyone in every way possible was invited through so many group processes to be a part of that conversation. They had to try not to be a part of it if they weren't. As to the diversity of the congregation, one of the things that occurred to me when I came here, when I learned that a number of our African American members who had been part of the congregation under Norman Fletcher and even before that, Dr. Weirs, was that in the 60s, when there was a Black Power movement and when it was made very uncomfortable for certain members of our congregation to not be members of African American congregations in town by being here, we lost a good number of our members that were African American. And the theory that I had was that African Americans had been invited into this congregation to become a part of this Western European legacy that we are, that they'd been invited to come in and be a part of the classicist pulpit, the classic music, that was all very Western European, and they had not been invited to come in and be a part of a congregation that was transforming by their participation in it. And so I went out and I tested that with Marjorie Baskerville and a couple of other people, but Marjorie I remember most, sitting down and talking with her because she had been one of the people that had left. And I asked Marjorie about that, and she said, yes, that's exactly why I left, and I understand that things are different there now, and I'm coming back. And she had heard of the work of our Undoing Racism Committee and what was going on in the congregation. And Marjorie came back, and she was 8th row back, 2nd seat in from the side aisle from that day until the day she died, except for the few Sundays that she was out of town or traveling. And what I learned about diversity in the congregation through that, and what I think the congregation learned about it, is yes, we have to be inviting of persons of color or otherwise marginalized people who are part of marginalized cultures in our society. We have to be very inviting. We have to be ready to welcome them when they come here. But much more than that, we have to be aware of who we are, each of us, in relationship with people, so that we're not stepping on what we're trying to do by our own biases and bigotries that we continue in their presence. We have to be self-analytical in terms of the privilege that we bring into here. And I think that this congregation has paid very close attention to the privilege that it holds, and as a result of that attention, we've been able to become more diverse. The marriage equality movement started a long time before marriage equality was achieved, and this congregation was a part of that from the very beginning. In the early days, it was the Lambda Society that was at the forefront, and this congregation was heavily involved in the Lambda Society. So we were involved in the project of Love Makes a Family, the photo essay that traveled around the country, and we were instrumental in the beginnings of that. It was, that was done through Verizon. So from the very earliest days of my ministry here, the congregation has been, from before the days of my ministry here, the congregation has been engaged in gay and lesbian rights, and then in the transition to marriage equality. And as a result of that, gay and lesbian families, head of families, have been able to bring their families here, knowing that this was a safe place for them to be, knowing that this was a place where their children could get the spiritual nurturance that they needed without the bigotry and the bias that they might find in other places in the community.